Hey there, truth seekers. Today we're cracking open a mystery so big, so completely scrubbed from the books, that most of you watching this right now have never even heard the name. Tartaria. Yeah, I'll wait while you Google it. Go ahead, I've got time, because here's the wild part. This wasn't some tiny kingdom or footnote civilization. We're talking about an empire that covered half of Eurasia, showed up on every single map for centuries, had capital cities, trade routes, the whole 9 yards. And then, poof, gone. Vanished from maps, textbooks, and collective memory faster than your ex deleted their dating profile. Now, I'm not saying this is the conspiracy to end all conspiracies. But I am saying that if you've ever wondered why those old buildings in your city look way too impressive for when they were supposedly built, or why entire first floors are mysteriously underground, you might want to stick around. Before we dive into this rabbit hole that goes deeper than you'd believe, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about the 1800s, and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to see how global this wake-up call really is. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how the world's most advanced civilization got completely erased, buried under mud, demolished at world's fairs, and scrubbed from every history book your kids are reading in school. Let's get into it. All right, let's talk about maps. Not the kind on your phone that can't figure out which side of the street you're actually on, but the real deal, hand-drawn, meticulously crafted cartographic masterpieces that took months or even years to complete. We're diving into something that honestly shouldn't make sense if you believe the standard history books. But here we are. Pull up any European map from the 1500s through the early 1800s, and you'll find something peculiar. Right there, sprawled across half of Eurasia like it owns the place, is a massive territory labeled Tartaria, or Tartary, or some variation of that name. And I'm not talking about a vague blob where cartographers just wrote, "Here be dragons," because they ran out of geographical information. No, this thing had borders. Clear, defined borders. It had provinces with names. It had capital cities marked with little castle symbols. It had trade routes crisscrossing through it like a medieval highway system. Now, before you think this was just one confused mapmaker having a creative day, let me stop you right there. We're talking about maps from Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Russia. Countries that, by the way, were often at war with each other and definitely weren't sitting around coordinating their cartographic efforts over afternoon tea. These weren't nations that shared information freely. They were rivals, competitors, sometimes outright enemies trying to conquer each other's territories and claim new lands for themselves. Yet somehow, across all these different cultures, languages, and political agendas, they all agreed on one thing. There was this massive empire called Tartaria sitting right there in Central and Northern Asia. The consistency is actually kind of unsettling when you think about it. Let's start with the basics. Open up a 1570 map by Abraham Ortelius, often called the father of modern cartography. There it is, Tartaria, big and bold. Move forward to 1606. Check out a map by Jodocus Hondius. Still there. Jump to 1707. Grab a map by Guillaume de Lisle, the French royal cartographer who had access to the best geographical intelligence of his time. Tartaria, present and accounted for. Fast forward to 1751. Examine the work of Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, another French cartographer known for his accuracy and scholarly approach. You guessed it. Tartaria is still dominating the Asian interior. We're talking about nearly 3 centuries of consistent documentation across multiple nations, cultures, and cartographic traditions. This wasn't some medieval legend or mythical kingdom like Atlantis. This was on official maps being used for navigation, trade, military planning, and education. And here's where it gets really interesting. These maps didn't just slap the word Tartaria on a big empty space and call it a day. They divided it up. You had independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Tibetan Tartary, and more. Each section had its own detailed internal geography. Cities were marked with their names and locations. Mountain ranges and river systems were carefully drawn. The level of detail suggests these cartographers had actual information about what was happening in these territories, not just speculation or folklore. They knew where the settlements were, they understood the geographical features, and they documented it all with the same care they gave to mapping Europe itself. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but maybe Tartaria was just what Europeans called a bunch of different regions they didn't fully understand, kind of like how they used to call everything east of the Mediterranean the Orient. Fair point, except for one problem. The maps show a structured political entity with administrative divisions. When you look at how European cartographers depicted places they genuinely didn't understand, they used vague terms and artistic flourishes to cover their ignorance. But Tartaria had the same cartographic treatment as France or Spain or the Ottoman Empire. It was presented as an organized state with recognizable governance structures, not a mysterious land of wandering tribes or unexplored wilderness. The British Museum holds dozens of these maps. The Library of Congress has them too. So does the National Library of France, the Russian State Library, and virtually every major archive in Europe. You can go look at them yourself if you're ever in these cities. Which means either this was the most successful coordinated hoax in cartographic history, executed across enemy nations for 300 years for absolutely no apparent reason, or these mapmakers were documenting something that actually existed. And here's the thing. Cartographers during this period were serious professionals. Their reputations depended on accuracy. A merchant using an inaccurate map could lose his entire fortune sailing to the wrong destination or missing a crucial trade route. Military commanders needed precise geographical intelligence to plan campaigns. These weren't decorative art pieces. They were functional tools with real-world consequences if they got things wrong. So we've established that Tartaria was a fixture on maps for centuries, documented by the best cartographers of their age, treated as a legitimate political entity with clear geographical boundaries. Everything's going fine, right? Wrong. Because here's where the story takes a sharp turn into seriously weird territory. Sometime around the mid-1800s, and I mean really suddenly, like someone flipped a switch, Tartaria vanishes. Gone. Disappeared from new maps as if it never existed. You can track this in real time if you're patient enough to examine maps chronologically. An 1821 map by John Carey clearly shows Tartary divided into its various regions. An 1850 map by John Tallis still has it, though the name is getting smaller and the borders less defined. But by 1860, 1870, you start seeing maps where that entire massive chunk of Eurasia has been relabeled as Russian Empire, China, Persia, and various other modern nation-states. The name Tartaria just stops appearing. Not gradually. Not with a slow transition where it fades from common usage over generations. It's more like one day the cartography community collectively decided, you know what? We're done with that whole Tartaria thing. Let's pretend it was never there. This is the equivalent of everyone on Earth waking up tomorrow and suddenly all maps call the United States North Britannia, and everyone just goes along with it like nothing happened. No historical explanation, no national rebranding campaign, no political revolution that would justify such a massive geographic renaming. just a silent, universal agreement to change the maps. And we're supposed to believe this was totally normal. That a territory covering millions of square miles, documented for 3 centuries by every major European power, just got renamed and nobody thought to write down why or how this happened. Come on. Here's what makes this even stranger. When countries undergo major political changes, when empires fall, when borders shift, when new nations emerge, there's always a paper trail. Treaties are signed, wars are fought, diplomatic correspondence flies back and forth. Historians write about it, newspapers report on it. Government archives fill up with documents explaining what happened and why. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved after World War I, we have mountains of documentation about how and why that occurred. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the entire world watched it happen in real time on television. These things don't just occur in silence. But the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, crickets, no treaties, no declarations, no historical accounts explaining. And this is how Tartaria ceased to be recognized as a distinct territory. It's like trying to find records of why everyone suddenly stopped using a word that used to be everywhere. The references just evaporate, without explanation. You can argue that maybe Tartaria was simply a Western European misunderstanding of Central Asian geography. And as knowledge improved, the name was dropped in favor of more accurate local names. Reasonable hypothesis, except for one glaring issue. The knowledge supposedly got worse before it got better. Earlier maps from the 1700s show incredible detail about Central Asian geography, cities, mountains, rivers, trade routes, all carefully documented. But the maps that replaced Tartaria in the late 1800s often show less detail about these regions, not more. Large swaths of Siberia and Central Asia get labeled as generic Russian territory, without the internal geographical specificity that earlier maps provided. So we're supposed to believe that as European exploration and scientific knowledge advanced throughout the 1800s, cartographers somehow knew less about this region than their predecessors? That's not how progress works. Knowledge doesn't typically move backward unless something is actively being suppressed or erased. And let's talk about the timing for a second, because it's suspiciously convenient. The mid-1800s, right when Tartaria disappears from maps, is the exact same period when we see other weird phenomena happening globally. Cities around the world are experiencing mysterious mud floods that bury first floors of buildings. Massive, architecturally advanced structures are being demolished at world's fairs and explained away as temporary constructions. Orphan train programs are shipping thousands of children to repopulate areas of North America. Advanced technologies that seemed commonplace in the early 1800s somehow vanish or get attributed to later inventors. It's almost like there was a coordinated effort to reshape both the physical and documentary landscape of the 19th century. And the erasure of Tartaria from maps was just one piece of a much larger operation. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like conspiracy theory territory. And yeah, I get it. But here's the thing about conspiracy theories. Sometimes they're wrong, but sometimes they're just inconvenient truths that haven't been fully investigated because the implications are too unsettling. The documented facts are these. Tartaria existed on maps for 300 years. It was depicted by cartographers from competing nations who had no reason to coordinate false information. It showed characteristics of an organized political entity. And then it vanished from new maps with no historical explanation for why this massive geographical feature was suddenly relabeled and forgotten. Those are facts you can verify yourself by examining historical maps in any major archive or library. The official explanation, when historians bother to address it at all, usually goes something like this. Tartary was a vague European term for the poorly understood regions of Central Asia. And as geographical knowledge improved, more precise names were adopted. Okay, but that doesn't explain the level of detail on pre-1850 maps. It doesn't explain why multiple competing nations used the same terminology and showed the same borders. It doesn't explain the sudden nature of the change rather than a gradual evolution of nomenclature. And it definitely doesn't explain why there's essentially zero historical documentation about this transition. When India went from being called the British Raj to simply India, there were decades of documentation, political movements, wars, and finally, independence celebrations. The death of Tartaria as a geographical term? Radio silence. Think about what it would take to pull something like this off. Assuming for a moment that Tartaria was indeed a real, organized civilization that got deliberately erased from history. You'd need to control cartographic institutions across multiple nations. You'd need to influence or replace the professionals creating new maps. You'd need to ensure that the next generation of maps uniformly adopted new naming conventions without explaining why the old ones were being discarded. You'd need to either destroy or bury historical documents that reference Tartaria in detail, or at minimum, ensure they weren't included in mainstream historical narratives. You'd need to coordinate all of this across countries that weren't exactly friendly with each other: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States. All during a period when these nations were competing for global dominance and colonial territories. That's not just difficult, that's almost impossibly complex. Almost. Unless, of course, there was some organization or network of organizations that transcended national boundaries and had influence over academic institutions, publishing houses, educational systems, and governmental archives. Some group that could shape the narrative being taught in universities and schools, that could decide which historical documents got preserved and which got conveniently lost, that could influence what appeared in textbooks and encyclopedias. If such a network existed, and we know from documented history that various secret societies and international organizations did exist during this period, then coordinating a cartographic erasure becomes more plausible. Not easy, not simple, but possible if enough resources and influence were brought to bear over a few critical decades. The smoking gun here is the uniformity. If Tartaria's disappearance from maps was a natural evolution of geographical knowledge, you'd expect to see variation. Some cartographers would adopt new terminology quickly. Others would stick with traditional names longer. There would be transitional periods where maps might include both old and new names, showing Tartaria, now part of the Russian Empire, or something similar. But that's not what we see. Instead, there's a relatively sharp cutoff where new maps simply stop using the term, as if someone sent out a memo saying, "Hey everyone, we're done with that word now. Update your maps accordingly." The synchronicity suggests coordination, not organic change. And here's another uncomfortable detail. Many of these maps from the 1700s and early 1800s are still around, sitting in archives and libraries, available for anyone to examine. Yet somehow, despite this being verifiable historical documentation, the mainstream historical narrative essentially ignores them. Tartaria isn't taught in schools. It's not in standard history textbooks. If you mention it to most people, even educated people with college degrees in history, they'll look at you like you're talking about Middle-earth or Narnia. How does a territory that appeared on official maps for 3 centuries become so thoroughly forgotten that its very existence sounds like fiction to modern ears? That level of erasure doesn't happen accidentally. That requires sustained effort over generations to ensure that information doesn't get passed down through educational systems and cultural memory. Some researchers have suggested that Tartaria might have been the last major civilization to possess advanced technologies that were later lost or suppressed. Things like wireless power transmission, advanced architectural techniques, sophisticated understanding of harmonics and frequencies for construction and energy generation. If that's true, if there was a civilization that had achieved technological advancement along different lines than our current industrial model, then erasing it from history makes more sense from a control perspective. Can't have people looking back and asking, wait, why did we abandon these better methods? Who decided we needed to forget this? Better to just scrub it from the maps, let a few generations pass, and by the time anyone notices, it's too late. The physical evidence is gone, the documentation is scattered or dismissed, and anyone bringing it up gets labeled a conspiracy theorist. The cartographic evidence is just the beginning, though. It's the thread you pull that starts unraveling a much larger tapestry of suppressed history. Because if Tartaria was real, if it was a functioning civilization with its own culture, technology, and governance, then what happened to it? Where did all the people go? What caused its fall? And most importantly, who benefited from ensuring it was forgotten? These are questions that the maps themselves can't answer, but they can prove something crucial. Whatever Tartaria was, it wasn't just a figment of imagination or a cartographic error. It was significant enough to dominate European maps for 300 years. And then it was significant enough for someone to want it erased. Every map tells a story about what the mapmaker knew and what they thought was important. For 3 centuries, European cartographers across multiple nations thought Tartaria was important enough to document in detail. Then, suddenly, uniformly, they decided it wasn't important anymore. Or more accurately, they were influenced to decide it wasn't important anymore. Maps are powerful tools of information and control. They shape how we understand geography, territory, and history. Whoever controls what appears on maps controls, to a significant degree, how people perceive reality itself. And in the mid-1800s, someone or some group decided that Tartaria needed to disappear from that perceived reality. So next time you're looking at an antique map in a museum or archive, pay attention to what's written across Central Asia. If it's from before 1850, you'll probably see Tartaria sitting right there, as real as any other empire of its time. If it's from after 1860, you'll see a gap where Tartaria used to be, filled in with other names, as if 300 years of cartographic consensus never happened. And ask yourself, what else might have been erased from our maps, our textbooks, and our collective memory? Because if they could delete an entire empire from history, what else have they made us forget? The maps don't lie, but they can be replaced. And sometimes, just sometimes, the maps we're not supposed to see anymore are the ones telling us the truth. So we've established that Tartaria was all over the maps until someone decided it shouldn't be. But here's where things get really interesting, because maps aren't the only evidence we have. There's a manuscript, written way back in 1357, that describes a world so different from what we're taught in history class that it might as well be science fiction. Except, here's the problem. It doesn't read like fiction. It reads like a bureaucratic travel report written by someone who's deeply annoyed that he has to explain all this obvious stuff to people who've never left their hometown. Welcome to The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a document that's been sitting in libraries for nearly 700 years. And yet somehow it's treated like a curious medieval fantasy rather than the historical bombshell it actually is. First, let's talk about who this guy was, or at least who he claimed to be. John Mandeville, assuming that's even his real name, which is debatable, presents himself as an English knight who spent decades traveling through Asia, the Middle East, and regions that modern historians insist were basically inaccessible to Europeans at the time. The mainstream narrative loves to dismiss this manuscript as medieval fan fiction, a collection of tall tales and legends compiled by someone who never left their monastery and just copied other travel accounts with extra embellishments. You know, like when your friend swears they totally went to that concert, but all their details sound suspiciously like the Wikipedia entry. The scholarly consensus is basically, yeah, this Mandeville character probably made it all up. Moving on. Except that explanation falls apart the moment you actually read the thing. Because unlike your typical medieval legend full of dragons, unicorns, and people with their faces in their chests, which, yes, medieval texts did include because apparently that's what passed for geography back then, Mandeville's account is surprisingly pragmatic. He describes political systems, trade routes, administrative structures, currency systems, architectural techniques, and social customs with the kind of detail that suggests first-hand observation, not imaginative storytelling. This isn't, and then I fought a giant sea serpent. This is, the local government collects taxes in this specific way, and here's how their postal system works. Not exactly the stuff of exciting medieval fantasy novels, which makes you wonder why someone would bother making it up. Let's get to the good part. The part that connects directly to our Tartaria investigation. Mandeville describes a place called Cathay. And before you say, that's just old-fashioned for China, hold on, because that's not what he's saying at all. He's very clear that Cathay is distinct from China, that these are separate political entities with their own systems of governance. He describes Cathay as the center of a vast empire, a place of incredible wealth and sophisticated civilization that makes contemporary European kingdoms look like amateur hour. And here's the kicker. His description of Cathay's geography, its political structure, and its cultural characteristics line up suspiciously well with what we know about Tartaria from those maps we just discussed. The manuscript describes Cathay as a land where gold is used not for hoarding in some dragon's lair, but as an actual building material for architecture. Now, that might sound crazy. Who builds with gold when you could just build with stone and keep the gold for, buying stuff? But think about it practically. If you have so much gold that it's more abundant than certain other building materials, if your empire controls the major gold-producing regions of Asia, then using it architecturally actually makes a weird kind of sense. It's like how aluminum used to be more valuable than gold in the 1800s until we figured out efficient extraction methods, and now we use it for soda cans and airplane parts. If gold is plentiful enough in your civilization, you use it where it's useful, and nothing says, we run this continent, quite like gold-plated architecture that other kingdoms can only dream of replicating. But here's what really gets me. Mandeville describes the currency system in Cathay as being based on processed leather, not precious metals. At first glance, that sounds ridiculous, right? Leather money. Except the more you think about it, the more sense it makes for a sophisticated economy. Precious metal currency has a fundamental problem. Its value fluctuates based on supply. It's heavy to transport in large quantities, and it can be counterfeited if you're good enough at metalworking. But a standardized leather currency, especially if it's produced and controlled by a central authority using specific techniques that are difficult to replicate, that's actually a pretty smart monetary system. It's lightweight, durable, and the government can control the money supply without being dependent on mining operations. It's almost like someone thought through the practical economics of running a massive empire, which is not typically how medieval fantasy stories work. Those usually involve more magic rings and less innovative monetary policy. And this is where Mandeville's credibility gets interesting. He doesn't just describe Cathay from a distance like some tourist who spent 3 days in a place and now considers himself an expert. He claims to have served the Great Khan for 15 months. 15 months. That's a weirdly specific time frame, by the way. If you're making up a story, you usually go with round numbers. I served him for 2 years, or I spent a year at his court. But 15 months? That's the kind of detail someone includes when they're recounting actual time spent somewhere, when they remember the specific duration because they lived it. It transforms his account from, "I heard about this place from someone else," to, "I worked in this administration, and here's what I observed during my government employment." The manuscript reads less like Marco Polo's adventures, which, let's be honest, sometimes sound like he's trying to one-up everyone at a medieval bar with increasingly impossible stories, and more like a bureaucratic report submitted by a diplomatic envoy. Mandeville describes administrative procedures, court protocols, taxation systems, and governance structures with the kind of bored precision that suggests he sat through a lot of meetings. This isn't the writing of someone having a grand adventure and embellishing for entertainment value. This is the writing of someone who had to understand how a foreign government worked, probably because his job depended on it, and he's documenting what he learned in case someone back home needs this information. It's essentially a really long, really detailed PowerPoint presentation about 14th century Asian geopolitics, which is not typically how people write fiction. Now here's where this manuscript becomes a problem for official history. According to the mainstream narrative, European contact with Central Asia in the 1300s was minimal and mostly limited to a few adventurous merchants traveling the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire was still a force, sure. But the idea that an English knight could just waltz into the court of the Great Khan, serve in some official capacity for over a year, and then write a detailed account of the political systems he encountered? That's not supposed to have happened. It doesn't fit the accepted timeline of European-Asian relations. It suggests a level of diplomatic and cultural exchange that historians insist didn't exist yet, or at least not to the extent Mandeville describes. But what if Mandeville wasn't describing the Mongol Empire that appears in our history books? What if he was documenting Tartaria, a civilization that was contemporary, with but distinct from what we're told existed in Central Asia during the 14th century? That would explain why his account doesn't quite match up with official histories of the Mongol successor states. He's not writing about the same entities that later historians decided were the only ones that mattered. He's writing about a political and cultural system that got conveniently erased from the historical record, just like it got erased from those maps 5 centuries later. The geographical descriptions in the manuscript are another interesting detail. Mandeville describes cities, trade routes, and regional divisions that don't quite align with what modern maps tell us should have been there. Now, medieval geography was notoriously unreliable. People thought Jerusalem was the center of the world and that India was basically next door to Ethiopia. So you'd expect some confusion. But Mandeville's geography isn't randomly wrong in the way medieval maps were usually wrong. It's systematically different, as if he's describing an alternate political geography that existed parallel to the one we're taught about. Cities in different locations than expected, regions divided differently, trade routes following paths that don't match the accepted historical understanding of Silk Road commerce. It's not that he's confused or making things up. It's that he's describing a version of Asia that doesn't match the official version that came later. And here's something that should bother anyone thinking critically about historical sources. This manuscript was wildly popular in medieval Europe. It was copied, translated, distributed, and read extensively throughout the late medieval period. This wasn't some obscure document gathering dust in a monastery basement. This was a bestseller by medieval standards, which means a lot of people in the 14th and 15th centuries found Mandeville's account convincing enough to copy and preserve. Yet somehow, by the time we get to the modern historical establishment, it's dismissed as obvious fiction, a curiosity with no real historical value beyond showing us what medieval people believed, even though they were totally wrong about everything. That's a fascinating transformation when you think about it. A document that was taken seriously for centuries suddenly becomes obviously fake once we get to the period when Tartaria is being erased from maps and history books. It's almost like someone decided that any evidence contradicting the new official narrative needed to be reframed as unreliable. Can't have people reading a 14th century account that describes a sophisticated Asian empire that doesn't match what we're now teaching in schools, right? Better to just label it medieval fantasy and move on. Nothing to see here, just ancient fake news. Definitely not a first-hand account of a civilization we've deliberately forgotten. Let's talk about the internal consistency of the manuscript for a moment, because this is where it gets really hard to maintain the "it's all made up" narrative. When people fabricate travel accounts, they tend to be inconsistent. They forget details they mentioned earlier, they contradict themselves. They include anachronistic information that wouldn't have been known at the time of the supposed events. But Mandeville's account maintains remarkable consistency throughout. His descriptions of Cathay's governmental structure, its cultural practices, its economic systems, they all reinforce each other. He doesn't contradict himself about how the currency works or what the political hierarchy looks like. The details stack up in a way that suggests either he's the most careful fiction writer in medieval history, maintaining continuity across hundreds of pages without error, or he's describing things he actually encountered and remembered consistently, because they were real. The manuscript also includes details that would be pointless to fabricate. He describes the weather patterns in different regions, the agricultural practices used by local populations, the types of diseases common in certain areas, the architectural techniques employed in different cities. This isn't exciting adventure content. This is mundane observational data that only makes sense if someone actually spent significant time in these places and paid attention to how daily life worked. If you're making up a story to impress people, you don't spend paragraphs describing local farming techniques and seasonal weather patterns. You include more fighting and treasure and exotic women and dangerous beasts. You know, the stuff that actually sells copies. The fact that Mandeville includes this boring, practical information suggests he's writing from experience, not imagination. Another interesting detail: Mandeville describes technological and architectural achievements in Cathay that seem impossibly advanced for the 14th century, at least according to what we're taught about that period. He mentions buildings of extraordinary height and complexity, engineering projects that shouldn't have been possible with medieval technology, and organizational systems that sound more like modern state bureaucracy than feudal governance. Now, mainstream historians use this as evidence that he must be making it up. See? He describes things that couldn't have existed, therefore the whole account is fantasy. But what if those things did exist? What if Tartaria had achieved levels of technological and organizational sophistication that don't fit our neat narrative of gradual historical progress? That would explain why Mandeville's descriptions seem impossible. Not because he invented them, but because the civilization he witnessed was more advanced than we're willing to admit existed in the 14th century. The manuscript also describes social customs and cultural practices that don't align with what we're told about Central Asian societies in the medieval period. Legal systems, educational institutions, artistic traditions, and social hierarchies that sound more complex and developed than the nomadic tribal confederations that official history insists dominated the region. Again, historians point to this as proof of fabrication, but it makes equal sense as evidence that the region was more culturally sophisticated than our history books acknowledge. Maybe the problem isn't that Mandeville is lying. Maybe the problem is that our historical narrative is incomplete or deliberately simplified to erase evidence of civilizations that don't fit the approved story. Here's what really gets me about the dismissal of this manuscript. It's treated with far more skepticism than other medieval travel accounts that are accepted as basically reliable. Marco Polo's travels, for instance, are treated as legitimate historical sources despite containing their own share of exaggerations and questionable claims. Why is Marco Polo taken seriously while Mandeville is dismissed as fantasy? Is it because Marco Polo's account doesn't threaten the official historical narrative in the same way? Because his descriptions of Asia, while exotic, don't suggest the existence of a massive empire that later got completely erased from history? It's suspicious that the accounts we're told to trust are the ones that align with the approved version of history, while accounts that contradict it get labeled as unreliable, regardless of their internal consistency or contemporary popularity. The timing of when Mandeville supposedly wrote this is also worth noting. 1357 is well before the period when Tartaria disappears from maps. He's writing about 500 years before that erasure happens, which means this manuscript serves as early documentary evidence of something that was later systematically removed from historical consciousness. It's a snapshot of a world that we're told never existed, written by someone who claimed to have witnessed it firsthand, preserved for centuries because people found it credible, and then retroactively dismissed once it became inconvenient for the official narrative. That's not how historical scholarship is supposed to work. You're supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not decide what the conclusion should be, and then work backward to dismiss anything that contradicts it. And let's address the elephant in the room. Who exactly was John Mandeville? Because even historians who study this manuscript admit they have no idea. There's no definitive evidence of an English knight by that name traveling through Asia in the 14th century. Some scholars think it might be a pen name. Others suggest it could be multiple authors writing under a single identity. And still others believe it might be entirely pseudonymous. But here's the thing. If this was just fantasy literature, why would the author hide their identity? Medieval writers of fiction weren't shy about taking credit for their work. They wanted recognition for their creative efforts. The anonymity or pseudonymity of Mandeville suggests something else. Perhaps this was someone with access to sensitive information, someone who needed to obscure their identity, because what they were documenting wasn't supposed to be widely known. A diplomatic envoy or intelligence operative who couldn't openly publish their observations without political consequences. So they used a fictional identity while keeping the actual content factual. That would explain both the mystery of the author's identity and the detailed practical nature of the information in the manuscript. The manuscript's description of the Great Khan's court is particularly detailed in ways that suggest insider knowledge. Mandeville describes the hierarchical structure of the administration, the protocols for approaching the Khan, the organization of military and civil bureaucracy, even the daily routines of court life. This isn't the kind of information a casual visitor would pick up. This is what you learn when you're actually working within a system, when you need to understand the power structures and procedures to do your job effectively. It's the difference between visiting Washington, D.C. as a tourist and actually working in a government agency. The former gives you superficial impressions, the latter gives you understanding of how the machine actually operates. Mandeville's account reads like the latter, which lends credibility to his claim of having served in the Khan's court for 15 months. What's particularly damning for the "it's all made up" theory is that Mandeville's manuscript doesn't include the kind of obviously fantastical elements that were common in admitted works of medieval fiction. Yes, there are some strange descriptions toward the edges of his account, stories about distant lands with unusual people and customs. But the core narrative about Cathay and the regions he claims to have visited extensively is remarkably grounded. He's not encountering wizards or magic or supernatural beings in the areas he describes in detail. He's describing complex human societies with recognizable social structures, economic systems, and political organizations. The fantastical elements, such as they are, show up only in the sections where he's clearly reporting second-hand information about places he didn't visit personally. That's actually pretty sophisticated as far as historical writing goes. Distinguishing between your first-hand observations and things you heard about but can't verify. The manuscript also describes trade networks and economic connections between Cathay and other regions in ways that suggest a highly integrated system of commerce spanning vast distances. This doesn't match what we're taught about medieval trade, which is typically portrayed as limited, dangerous, and sporadic. But if Tartaria existed as a unified political entity or confederation controlling the interior of Asia, then Mandeville's descriptions of sophisticated trade networks make perfect sense. You'd have established routes, regulated commerce, official standards for weights and measures, and the kind of economic integration that facilitates long-distance trade. The fact that this doesn't align with our understanding of medieval commerce doesn't mean Mandeville is wrong. It might mean our understanding is incomplete. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this manuscript is what it represents. A window into a pre-erasure world written before someone decided that Tartaria needed to be forgotten. Mandeville wrote this in 1357, when Tartaria was still a recognized reality, before the multi-century project of removing it from maps and historical memory began. His account preserves details about that civilization that were later systematically destroyed or hidden. It's like having a photograph of something that was later demolished. You can argue all day about whether the photograph is real or reliable, but it's still evidence that something stood there before it was torn down. The 1357 manuscript is that photograph, showing us a world that later generations worked very hard to make us forget ever existed. So when historians dismiss this manuscript as medieval fantasy, maybe ask yourself, fantasy according to what standard? According to the historical narrative that was constructed after Tartaria was erased? That's circular reasoning. This account can't be true because it describes something we say didn't exist. And we know it didn't exist because accounts describing it must be false. That's not scholarship. That's narrative enforcement. Real historical investigation means taking inconvenient evidence seriously, not dismissing it because it challenges established conclusions. And Mandeville's manuscript is very inconvenient. We stand it for anyone invested in maintaining the official story about Central Asian history and the non-existence of Tartaria. The last written testimony, indeed. A voice from 1357 telling us about a world that was later erased, preserved in libraries for 7 centuries, read by countless people who found it credible, and then retroactively dismissed once that world needed to be forgotten. But it's still there, waiting in archives, ready for anyone willing to read it with fresh eyes and ask uncomfortable questions about why we're so eager to call it fiction when it reads like a bureaucratic report from a civilization we've been taught never existed. So we've talked about how Tartaria got scrubbed from maps and how medieval manuscripts describing it got dismissed as fantasy. Now let's talk about something you can literally walk past every single day without noticing, something so widespread that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'm talking about buried buildings, not ancient ruins that sank into the ground over millennia. I'm talking about 19th century structures that somehow ended up with their first floors underground, their grand entrance doors now leading to basements, and their windows staring at sidewalk, level like confused eyes wondering how they ended up down there. This isn't happening in 1 or 2 weird locations. This is a global phenomenon affecting cities from Seattle to Moscow, from San Francisco to Rome. And the official explanation is so inadequate, it might as well be, a wizard did it. Let's start with what you can verify yourself next time you're walking through any major city built before 1900. Look at the old buildings. Really look at them. Notice how many have windows at street level that are clearly too fancy, too large and too ornate to be basement windows. Notice the doorways that have been blocked off and now sit below the current sidewalk, accessible only by going down a flight of stairs that seems to lead to a basement, but has architectural details suggesting it was once the main entrance. Notice how the proportions of these buildings seem off, like they're missing their bottom floor. That's because they are. The first floor isn't missing, it's buried. And this isn't just a few buildings here and there. In some cities, entire neighborhoods show this pattern. It's like someone hit the lower terrain button on the whole urban landscape, and nobody bothered to mention it in the history books. Now, the official story, when historians bother to address this at all, and let me be clear, most don't because it's awkward, is that cities gradually raise their street levels over time for various practical reasons. Better drainage, sewage systems, flood prevention, that sort of thing. Seattle, for instance, has a whole underground tour where they'll cheerfully explain that after a fire in 1889, the city decided to raise the street level by filling in the gaps between buildings. And that's why the old first floors are now underground. Okay, sure, that's a reasonable explanation for one city that had a specific disaster and rebuilding effort. But when you find the exact same pattern in dozens of cities that didn't have catastrophic fires, didn't have the same engineering challenges, and weren't coordinating their urban planning efforts with each other, the gradual street-raising story starts to sound like an excuse rather than an explanation. Let's talk about the depth and uniformity of this phenomenon, because this is where it gets really suspicious. When you look at buried buildings across different cities, you often find the same burial depth, typically 10 to 15 feet of compacted earth separating the original ground level from the current street surface. Now, if this was really just cities independently deciding to raise their streets for sewage or drainage, you'd expect massive variation. Each city would raise their streets based on their specific needs, terrain, and engineering constraints. Some would go up 3 feet, others might go 8 feet. It would be all over the place. But instead, you get this remarkably consistent depth across cities that had completely different geographical conditions, different time periods of development, and different stated reasons for needing higher streets. It's like someone used the same blueprint for burying cities around the world, which is not how organic urban development works. And let's address the timeline, because this is crucial. The vast majority of these buried first floors date to the mid-1800s. We're talking about a concentrated period roughly from 1840 to 1880, when cities around the world apparently decided it was time to just bury their ground floors and pretend that was normal. Before this period, buildings had proper first floors at ground level. After this period, new buildings were constructed with their first floors already elevated to match the new street level, because presumably someone told them, "Hey, the ground level has permanently changed, so build accordingly." But during this transitional period, you get this bizarre architectural record of buildings that clearly weren't designed to have their ground floors buried, but ended up that way anyway. The question nobody seems to want to answer is, what happened to cause simultaneous ground level changes across cities on different continents? Seattle's official story involves that 1889 fire, as I mentioned. But here's what's weird about it. The fire destroyed wooden buildings, yes, and the city rebuilt, yes. But the story goes that they decided to raise the streets while rebuilding to improve drainage and prevent flooding from high tides. Reasonable so far. But photographs from the period show they weren't gradually filling in streets over years of construction. They brought in massive amounts of filled dirt relatively quickly and just buried the old first floors. And the official narrative is that property owners were totally cool with this, that they just went ahead and turned their main floors into basements, remodeled their second floors to be new main floors, and nobody made a big fuss about losing valuable ground floor commercial space. That's like telling someone, "We're going to bury the first floor of your store 12 feet underground, You'll have to move everything upstairs, lose your storefront visibility, and probably spend a fortune on renovations. But it's for the greater good of sewage management. How many property owners would actually agree to that without massive compensation or legal fights? But Seattle isn't even the most dramatic example. Let's talk about what's hidden under modern Moscow. Underground excavations and utility work have revealed entire layers of earlier city construction buried beneath the current street level. Buildings with elaborate facades, architectural ornamentation that nobody would waste on basement construction, and street layouts that clearly functioned as surface-level urban infrastructure before getting buried. The official explanation involves the gradual accumulation of dirt over centuries, which works for ancient Roman ruins, but doesn't really explain 19th century buildings that look like they were hastily covered up, rather than slowly buried by natural processes. And it's not just Moscow. St. Petersburg, Kazan, and other Russian cities show the same pattern. It's almost like something happened across the Russian Empire in the mid-1800s that required quickly burying evidence of what came before. Now let's head over to North America, where the pattern continues. San Francisco has multiple layers of old city buried beneath its modern streets, with old building foundations, streets, and infrastructure discovered whenever they dig for new construction. Chicago, after its famous fire of 1871, supposedly raised its street levels for similar reasons as Seattle. But again, we see this remarkably uniform burial depth and a suspicious lack of contemporary accounts from property owners complaining about their buildings being half buried. Boston has entire neighborhoods where the original ground floors are now basements. And if you explore the oldest parts of the city, you'll find doorways and windows that clearly weren't designed for basement use, but ended up there anyway. The pattern repeats in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and dozens of other cities. It's like someone went on a city-burying spree across North America in the mid to late 1800s. European cities show the same phenomenon. Rome has layers upon layers of construction, which historians love to attribute to centuries of gradual accumulation. Except when you look at the most recent layers of burial, specifically from the 1800s. The pattern looks less like gradual accumulation and more like sudden coverage. Paris underwent massive reconstruction under Baron Haussmann in the mid-1800s. And while the official story is all about beautiful boulevards and modern urban planning, less attention is paid to how much of old Paris got buried in the process. London, Edinburgh, Istanbul, they all have these buried layers from the same time period, all with the same suspiciously uniform characteristics. Here's what really bothers me about the official street raising explanation. It assumes that pre-industrial societies in the mid-1800s had the organizational capacity and resources to move millions of tons of earth. Coordinate this effort across entire cities and do it so uniformly that buildings across vast distances ended up buried to similar depths. These are societies that historians tell us were still figuring out basic sanitation and urban planning. Their engineering capabilities were supposedly limited. They didn't have modern earth-moving equipment. No bulldozers, no dump trucks, no hydraulic excavators. What they had were horses, carts, shovels, and manual labor. Yet somehow these primitive by our standard societies moved enough earth to bury entire city blocks. Did it quickly enough that it appears coordinated, and convinced property owners to go along with having their valuable street-level real estate buried underground. The logistics of this are actually insane when you think about it, but there's another possibility, one that sounds crazy until you consider the evidence. What if these cities weren't gradually buried by deliberate street raising, but rapidly buried by some kind of catastrophic event? Specifically, a phenomenon that could be called a mud flood. Imagine a technology or natural disaster capable of suddenly liquefying soil, turning stable ground into a fluid mass that flows like water and then rapidly solidifies again. Such an event could bury buildings to a uniform depth across wide areas in a matter of hours or days, not years. The compacted earth found between original and current street levels has characteristics that actually support this theory. It's not neatly layered like filled dirt that was gradually brought in and compacted over time. It's densely packed and homogeneous, more consistent with soil that was liquefied and then settled rapidly. Soil liquefaction is a real phenomenon, usually associated with earthquakes. When seismic activity causes water-saturated soil to lose its strength and stiffness, it can temporarily behave like a liquid. Buildings sink, ground levels shift, and when everything settles, you can end up with structures partially buried. But natural liquefaction from earthquakes is localized. It affects specific areas based on soil composition and water table levels. What we're looking at with the mid-1800s burial phenomenon is something else entirely. Simultaneous soil burial across cities that didn't experience major earthquakes at the same time, in regions with completely different geological conditions. If this was liquefaction, it wasn't natural. It was induced. Now, before you dismiss this as impossible, consider what technologies might have existed in the mid-1800s that we've conveniently forgotten about. We know from patent records and scientific journals of the period that researchers were experimenting with electromagnetic technologies, harmonic frequencies, and ways to affect matter through vibrational resonance. Nikola Tesla, slightly later in the century, demonstrated technologies that could cause structural resonance and claimed that with the right frequency, he could shake apart buildings or even affect geological structures. What if someone figured out how to apply similar principles to soil itself? A device capable of generating specific frequencies that temporarily disrupted soil cohesion across wide areas could theoretically cause rapid burial of existing structures while leaving the underlying bedrock and newer construction unaffected. It sounds like science fiction, except we know the science of resonance and frequency was being actively explored during this exact time period. Think about the strategic value of such a weapon if it existed. You wouldn't need to demolish buildings individually, fight house-to-house battles, or deal with the messy business of physically destroying an empire's infrastructure. You could simply bury it. Flip a switch, activate your soil liquefaction technology, and watch entire cities sink 10 to 15 feet into the suddenly fluid earth. Wait for it to resolidify, and boom! You've instantly created a situation where the previous civilization's architecture is now underground, unusable, and eventually forgotten. Future generations will assume those basement windows were always basement windows, that those buried doorways were always sub-level entrances, and that the current ground level is the only ground level that ever existed. It's the perfect erasure technology. Comprehensive, deniable, and self-obscuring, because nobody would believe something so large-scale was anything other than natural or gradual. And here's the thing about the timing. The mid-1800s is precisely when Tartaria disappears from maps, when educational systems start uniformly removing references to it, when all these other weird historical discontinuities start showing up. If Tartaria was a real civilization that needed to be erased, burying its cities would be a crucial step. Can't have people wandering through intact Tartarian architecture asking awkward questions about who built these magnificent structures. Much better to bury the first floors, let a few decades pass, and let the new narrative, "We built all this, it's always been ours," take root in collective memory. By the time anyone thinks to ask questions, the physical evidence is underground, and the documentary evidence has been scrubbed from maps and textbooks. Let me address the obvious objection. If entire cities got buried by some kind of catastrophic mud flood event, surely people would have noticed and written about it extensively. Where are the newspaper accounts, the government reports, the personal diaries describing this traumatic experience? Well, here's where it gets interesting. There actually are scattered references to major floods, unusual weather events, and mud rains in newspapers and journals from the 1850s through 1880s. These accounts are often dismissed as exaggerations or local anomalies. But when you compile them geographically and temporally, patterns emerge. Reports of unusual atmospheric conditions, strange rain composed partly of mud or dust, and rapid soil accumulation show up in locations that later exhibit the buried building phenomenon. But these accounts are fragmentary, localized, and never compiled into a coherent historical narrative. It's like the evidence exists, but has been deliberately scattered so nobody sees the full picture. Also consider the possibility that areas experiencing rapid burial would be in chaos. If your city just sank 12 feet into the ground, your immediate concerns are survival, rescue, and figuring out what the hell just happened. Not making sure your experience gets properly documented for historians 150 years in the future. By the time things stabilize and people start writing official accounts, there's pressure to normalize what happened, to fit it into an acceptable, explanatory framework. The city raised its streets for better drainage sounds a lot better in a government report than some kind of impossible disaster buried us and we have no idea what caused it. Authorities have every incentive to provide a rational explanation, even if it doesn't quite match what actually occurred, because admitting you don't know what happened creates panic and questions you can't answer. The uniformity of burial depth across different cities is really the smoking gun here. If cities were independently raising their streets for local engineering reasons, you'd see different solutions to different problems. But a uniform burial depth suggests a uniform cause, something that affected cities regardless of their individual geographical or infrastructural characteristics. Natural disasters don't work that way. Earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, they all create chaos, but not uniformity. Their effects vary wildly based on terrain, proximity to the event source, and local conditions. But a technological weapon designed to induce soil liquefaction to a specific depth, that would create exactly the kind of uniformity we observe. Let's also talk about what's been found underground when people do excavate beneath modern cities. We're not just finding rough foundations and primitive construction. We're finding elaborate stonework, sophisticated architectural details, advanced engineering that supposedly shouldn't exist in mid-1800s construction, and evidence of urban planning that seems too developed for the time period. In some locations, underground spaces reveal multiple layers of previous construction, each layer more architecturally advanced than the official timeline would predict. It's like archaeological stratification in reverse. The deeper you go, the more advanced the construction becomes, which is the opposite of what you'd expect if civilization was steadily progressing upward through time. The official timeline has other problems too. According to standard history, these magnificent 19th century buildings, the ones now partially buried, were constructed by societies that were supposedly still relatively primitive in their construction capabilities. They had access to basic tools, manual labor, and horse-drawn transport, yet they allegedly created structures with mathematical precision, advanced stone-cutting techniques, and architectural features that modern builders would struggle to replicate. Then these same societies supposedly decided to bury their own magnificent recent creations under tons of dirt for sewage purposes. Does that sound like a coherent narrative to you? Or does it sound like someone trying to explain physical evidence that doesn't fit the official story? Think about the economic waste involved in the street raising explanation. Property owners in the mid-1800s would have seen their valuable street-level commercial space, the most desirable real estate in any urban setting, converted to below-ground storage areas. They would have had to renovate their buildings, create new entrances at what used to be the second floor, and figure out how to maintain business continuity during this massive disruption. All of this would have cost enormous amounts of money. Yet according to the official narrative, this happened simultaneously in cities around the world. And somehow, Everyone just went along with it. Where are the records of property value disputes? Where are the lawsuits? Where are the angry public meetings and newspaper editorials complaining about this massive government overreach? The silence is deafening, and it suggests that maybe the official explanation isn't what actually happened. Here's another uncomfortable detail. Many of the buried structures show signs of being inhabited right up until the burial event, and then suddenly abandoned. You find furniture, personal items, commercial goods, and evidence of normal daily life that just stops at the burial level. If street raising was a gradual, planned process, you'd expect orderly evacuation and removal of valuables before the ground floor got buried. Instead, the archaeological record suggests sudden abandonment, as if people had to leave quickly and couldn't take everything with them. That's consistent with a catastrophic event, not a managed urban planning project. The mud flood theory also explains some other weird phenomena from the mid-1800s that don't make sense in isolation. Why were there suddenly so many orphans that special trains were needed to redistribute them to repopulate Western territories? Maybe because entire populations in certain areas were devastated by the catastrophe. Why do so many buildings from this period show evidence of fire damage? Maybe because when buildings partially sink and their upper floors are suddenly at ground level, heating systems designed for different floor configurations could cause fires. Why are there so many reports of epidemics and diseases in the 1850s to 1880s? Maybe because burying organic material and disrupting sewage systems on a massive scale creates perfect conditions for disease outbreaks. All these seemingly unrelated historical phenomena might actually be connected consequences of the same catastrophic event. And let's be clear about what this means if the mud flood theory is correct. We're not talking about a natural disaster that inconveniently happened during the same period that Tartaria was being erased from maps. We're talking about a deliberate weapon used to physically erase the evidence of a previous civilization. Someone had the technology to induce soil liquefaction across vast distances. Someone coordinated its deployment to target specific urban areas. Someone ensured that the aftermath would be explained as gradual street raising rather than catastrophic burial. And someone made sure that the full scope of what happened would never make it into the history books as a connected series of events. That level of coordination and cover-up doesn't happen by accident. It requires organization, resources, and control over information flows across multiple nations and institutions. The physical evidence is everywhere once you start looking for it. Buried windows staring blankly at sidewalks. Doorways that lead down instead of forward. Basement spaces with architectural grandeur that makes no sense for below-ground construction. Entire neighborhoods sitting 12 feet lower than they should. And yet, somehow we've been conditioned to walk past this evidence every day, without questioning it, to accept the inadequate official explanations without pushing back, to dismiss anyone who points out the inconsistencies as a conspiracy theorist. That's how good the erasure operation was. They didn't just bury the buildings, they buried the very idea that anything unusual happened. So next time you're walking through an old city, look down at those basement windows. Ask yourself, were those really designed to be underground, or did something bury them there? Check out the proportions of 19th century buildings. Do they look complete? Or do they look like they're missing their bottom floor? Look for doorways that now lead to basements, but have decorative elements suggesting they were once grand entrances. The evidence is literally under your feet, waiting for you to notice it, waiting for someone to ask the obvious question. What really happened to bury entire cities in the mid-1800s? And why don't we have a coherent historical explanation for something so massive and widespread? The Great Mud Flood wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a weapon of mass burial, a technology for erasing civilizations by literally covering them up, and then rewriting history to say nothing unusual happened. And if they could pull that off, If they could bury cities around the world and convince future generations it was all just gradual street raising, then what else have they made us forget? All right, so we've covered how Tartaria got scrubbed from maps, how historical manuscripts describing it got dismissed as medieval fantasy, and how entire cities got buried to hide physical evidence. But here's the really insidious part. The mechanism that ensures this erasure sticks across generations. The education system. Think about it. You can bury buildings, you can destroy documents, you can redraw maps. But none of that matters if the next generation grows up learning the truth. The real power move isn't erasing evidence in the present. It's ensuring that future generations never even know there's something missing. And that's exactly what happened with Tartaria. It didn't just disappear from contemporary records. It was systematically removed from educational curricula worldwide, ensuring that by the time we get to the 20th and 21st centuries, the vast majority of educated people have never even heard the name. And I'm not talking about some obscure historical footnote that reasonably got left out of crowded syllabi. I'm talking about an empire that dominated half of Eurasia for centuries, appeared on every major map, and somehow doesn't rate a single mention in standard history education. That's not an oversight. That's deliberate. Let's start with a thought experiment. Go find any history textbook used in high schools or universities today. Doesn't matter which country, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Look at how much space is dedicated to European history. You'll find detailed chapters on the Roman Empire, medieval European kingdoms, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, colonial expansion, and so on. European history gets the full treatment. Names, dates, political intrigue, cultural developments, technological advances, the works. Now flip to the section on Asian history. Notice anything different? Suddenly we're getting the highlight reel, the greatest hits compilation, the Asian history for people who don't really care about Asian history version. You'll get a brief mention of ancient China, maybe some stuff about the Mongol Empire if you're lucky, a paragraph about the Silk Road, and then we basically skip ahead to modern times. The level of detail drops dramatically. The complexity gets flattened out, and entire centuries get compressed into a few pages. This isn't because Asian history is less complex or less important. It's because the curriculum has been deliberately structured to minimize attention to regions where Tartaria would have been. And here's the really clever part of this educational sabotage. It's not that textbooks explicitly deny Tartaria's existence. That would be too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, they simply act as if Central Asia barely matters for most of recorded history. The entire interior of the Eurasian continent, the exact region where Tartaria would have dominated, gets treated as a blank space in historical narratives, a transitional zone that we pass through quickly on our way to more important topics. The Mongol Empire gets a mention because it's too big to ignore and it directly impacted Europe. But what happened in that region before and after the Mongols? According to textbooks, apparently nothing worth teaching. The message is clear. This region wasn't historically significant, so there's no reason to investigate it deeply, and definitely no reason to wonder if something major has been left out. It's gaslighting on an academic scale. Now, you might think this Eurocentric bias is just a natural result of Western countries writing their own textbooks and focusing on their own history. That would be a reasonable explanation if we were only seeing this pattern in American and European schools. But here's where it gets weird. You find the same gaps in textbooks published in Russia, China, Japan, India, and other Asian countries. These are nations that should be deeply invested in thoroughly teaching their own regional history, yet somehow they also gloss over the Central Asian interior in ways that conveniently erase where Tartaria would have been. It's almost like there was an international agreement among academic institutions to collectively forget about this region's historical complexity. And before you say that sounds too coordinated to be possible, remember we're talking about the same period, late 1800s through early 1900s, when standardized national education systems were being established worldwide. If you wanted to control what future generations knew about history, taking control of curricula during this formative period would be the perfect opportunity. Let's look at what education about Central Asia actually looked like before the mid-1800s, back when Tartaria was still on the maps and people still acknowledged its existence. Educational materials from the 1700s and early 1800s. Geography books, atlases for schools, historical references, routinely included Tartary as a major geographical and political entity. Students learned about its provinces, its major cities, its relationship to neighboring powers. It was treated as an essential part of understanding Asian geography and politics, just like learning about France or Spain was essential for understanding Europe. But then something shifts dramatically after the 1850s. By the 1880s and 1890s, when modern standardized education systems are being established, Tartaria has completely vanished from geography and history curricula. New textbooks covering the exact same geographical regions simply don't mention it. The maps in educational materials show the same areas, but with different labels. Students are taught about Russian territories in Asia, or Chinese border regions, but never about the Tartarian Empire that earlier generations learned about as a matter of course. This transition didn't happen gradually or naturally. It happened suddenly and uniformly across multiple countries with different educational systems. That's the smoking gun right there. If Tartaria was simply being forgotten due to irrelevance or natural evolution of historical understanding, you'd expect variation. Some educational systems would drop it earlier, others would maintain references longer. There would be debate in academic circles about how to handle this shift in nomenclature. Teachers would write to publishers asking why the new textbooks are so different from the old ones. But we don't see any of that. Instead, there's a synchronized deletion, as if someone issued a directive to all major educational publishers and academic institutions. Tartaria is out. Effective immediately. Update your materials accordingly. Questions will not be entertained. The uniformity suggests coordination at a level that transcends individual nations or educational philosophies. And it's not just that Tartaria itself gets removed. The entire conceptual framework that would allow students to wonder about it gets restructured. Modern history education divides Asia into neat, familiar categories: China, Russia, India, the Middle East, Japan, and so on. These become the organizing principles through which students learn geography and history. But this framework doesn't leave room for a massive empire occupying the central interior of the continent. By structuring the curriculum around these accepted nation-states and regions, textbooks ensure that students won't even have the mental map that would make them ask, wait, what was going on in the middle of all these places? The gaps are hidden by how the information is categorized. It's like organizing your closet in a way that makes people not notice there's a whole section missing. You just structure the visible parts so cleverly that nobody realizes something should be there. Let's talk about the mechanics of how this censorship gets maintained over time. Because it's not like there's a secret committee meeting every year to ensure Tartaria stays out of textbooks. By now, it's self-perpetuating. Teachers teach what they were taught, which is what their teachers were taught, going back to the generation that first learned from the post-erasure curriculum. Modern historians and educators genuinely believe there's nothing to teach about Tartaria because they were never taught about it themselves. They look at the same old maps that clearly show Tartaria and either don't notice it or dismiss it as an archaic term that doesn't matter. When someone brings it up, the academic response is basically, well, it's not in any of the standard reference materials, so it must not have been important. But of course, it's not in the standard reference materials. That's the whole point of the erasure. The absence of information becomes self-justifying. We don't teach it because there's no established curriculum for it. And there's no established curriculum for it because we don't teach it. Perfect circular logic that ensures nothing changes. Academic gatekeeping plays a huge role in maintaining the status quo. Try submitting a doctoral thesis proposing that Tartaria was a significant political entity that's been deliberately erased from history. Good luck getting that past your dissertation committee. Your advisors would either laugh you out of the room or gently suggest you pursue more mainstream research topics if you want to have any hope of an academic career. Publish a paper arguing that history textbooks have systematically excluded a major empire, and watch how quickly academic journals reject it without serious peer review. The institutional incentives all push toward conformity with established narratives. Questioning fundamental assumptions about what did or didn't exist in history is career suicide, unless you're already an established name with enough credibility to weather the controversy. And even then, you'll be marginalized, cited as an example of how even smart people can fall down conspiracy rabbit holes. The system protects itself by making dissent professionally costly. Here's a fun exercise you can do yourself. Go to a university library and compare history textbooks from different decades. Find a comprehensive world history textbook from 1840, one from 1880, one from 1920, one from 1960, and one from 2000. Track how they handle Central Asian geography and history. You'll see the shift happen right around that 1850s to 1880s transition period. The pre-1850s books treat Tartary as a real place with political significance. The post-1880 books treat the region as if it was always just an extension of Russian and Chinese territories, with no independent historical identity. The 20th century books continue and deepen this pattern, adding more detail about European and modern history, while further compressing Asian history into simplified narratives. By the time you get to contemporary textbooks, Central Asia is barely present at all, except as a staging ground for the Silk Road, and a place Genghis Khan rode through on his way to somewhere more important. The progression is right there in black and white, documented in the evolution of educational materials. Yet somehow this massive shift in how we teach geography and history isn't considered worthy of examination or explanation. The language used in modern textbooks also reveals the bias. When European regions are discussed, you get specific political entities. The Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Republic of Venice, and so on. Each gets treated as a distinct entity with its own history, culture, and political development. But when textbooks discuss Central Asia, they use vague generalizations. Nomadic peoples, tribal confederations, the steppe, as if the entire region was just an undifferentiated mass of wandering horsemen with no sophisticated political structures. This linguistic choice isn't neutral. It shapes how students conceptualize these regions. If you're taught that Central Asia was just tribes and nomads, you won't be looking for evidence of organized empires or advanced civilizations. You've been primed to think nothing important was happening there. So you won't question why there's so little detail in your textbooks. The framing does the censorship work without anyone having to explicitly say, "Don't think about Tartaria." And let's address the elephant in the room. Why would academic institutions across multiple countries cooperate in this kind of historical revisionism? What's the motive? Well, consider who benefits from ensuring that people don't know about Tartaria. If it was indeed a sophisticated civilization with advanced technology and organizational capacity, and if it was deliberately destroyed and erased, then the powers responsible for that destruction would have a vested interest in ensuring nobody learns about what was lost. Can't have future generations asking uncomfortable questions like, Why did we destroy this civilization instead of learning from it? Or, what technologies did they have that we don't anymore? Or, who authorized this and why? Better to just skip over the whole thing, let a few generations pass, and by the time anyone stumbles across evidence of Tartaria in old maps or manuscripts, they'll have no educational framework for understanding what they're looking at. They'll dismiss it as a cartographic error or historical curiosity because they've been taught implicitly that nothing important could have existed there. The standardization of education systems in the late 1800s provided the perfect mechanism for this. Before then, education was more localized and varied. Different regions might teach different versions of history, use different textbooks, and emphasize different topics. But as nations developed standardized curricula, partly for legitimate reasons like ensuring educational quality and partly for more sinister reasons like social control and nationalist indoctrination, it became possible to enforce uniformity on a massive scale. If you control what goes into the standard curriculum, you control what millions of students learn. And if multiple nations coordinate their curricula, either through formal agreements or informal academic networks, you can ensure that the same gaps and biases appear in education systems worldwide. By the early 20th century, this standardization was largely complete, and Tartaria had been successfully erased from the collective educational consciousness of multiple generations. Think about what this means practically. In the year 2025, you can have a PhD in history from a top university. You can teach history at the college level. You can publish extensively in academic journals. And you might still have never encountered the name Tartaria in your entire educational career. Despite it being a prominent feature on maps for 3 centuries, despite it being discussed in historical texts, despite it being part of the geographical vocabulary of educated people for hundreds of years, a modern historian can go through 20+ years of education and never once be exposed to this term. That level of omission doesn't happen by accident. That requires systematic exclusion maintained across multiple levels of education over multiple generations. It's the educational equivalent of memory holing. Not just forgetting something, but actively ensuring it stays forgotten. The internet has actually made this worse in some ways. Because now, instead of having to control physical textbooks and libraries, the controllers of information have to manage digital references and search results. And they've gotten pretty good at it. Search for Tartaria online, and you'll find some information, sure. But it's mostly dismissed as a conspiracy theory, or relegated to alternative history forums where serious academics don't venture. Wikipedia, the go-to reference for most people, treats Tartaria as a historical curiosity, a name that referred to vaguely defined regions but had no real political significance. The discussion pages for these articles reveal something interesting, though. There are constant attempts by users to add more substantial information about Tartaria, and these attempts are consistently rejected by the Wikipedia editors who control what makes it into the final articles. The gatekeeping has moved online, but it's just as effective. Maybe more so, because at least with physical books, you could dig through archives and find the older editions that told a different story. With digital information, previous versions can be updated and overwritten, making it harder to track how the narrative has changed. Let's also talk about what happens when students do stumble across references to Tartaria, usually by accident, while researching something else or browsing old maps. If they bring it up to their history teachers or professors, they'll almost always get one of a few stock responses. Oh, that was just a European name for a vaguely defined region of Asia. It wasn't a real political entity. Or, that's a common misconception based on outdated cartography. Or my personal favorite. That's been debunked. You shouldn't waste time on conspiracy theories when we have actual history to learn. Notice the pattern in these responses. They don't engage with the evidence. They just dismiss the question. No explanation for why the name appeared consistently on maps for 3 centuries. No discussion of why primary sources from the period treated it as a real place. No acknowledgement that the sudden disappearance of the term from maps and texts in the mid-1800s is historically unusual and worth investigating. Just a quick dismissal designed to make the student feel slightly embarrassed for asking and discourage further inquiry. That's how institutional gatekeeping works. Not through explicit censorship, but through social pressure and intellectual condescension. The compression of Asian history in textbooks is particularly egregious when you realize how much time and detail is devoted to European history during the same periods. Students learn extensive details about the 100 Years' War between England and France, but get maybe a paragraph about the entire 13th through 15th centuries in Central Asia. They study the complex political dynamics of Renaissance Italian city-states, but are taught virtually nothing about the political structures of Central Asian powers during the same era. This isn't because more historical documentation exists for Europe. It's because the curriculum has been structured to de-emphasize certain regions and perspectives. And conveniently, the regions that get de-emphasized are exactly the ones where Tartaria would have been prominent. It's almost like the curriculum was designed specifically to ensure students wouldn't have the contextual knowledge that would make them question the official narrative. There's also the issue of how maps are taught in geography classes. Modern students learn to read contemporary political maps, showing current nations and borders, but rarely learn to analyze historical maps critically. They're not encouraged to compare maps from different time periods and ask why geographical nomenclature changed. They're not taught to question why certain features appear on old maps but not new ones. Map literacy education focuses on understanding contemporary geography, not on investigating how our understanding of geography has changed over time and what those changes might reveal. This is convenient for maintaining the Tartaria erasure, because if students develop the habit of critically comparing historical maps, they'd inevitably notice that massive empire covering Central Asia in pre-1850 maps and wonder what happened to it. Better to just not teach that kind of comparative analysis and keep students focused on memorizing current political boundaries. The standardization of language in academia also plays a role. When historians discuss Central Asian history, they use specific terminology that's been normalized within the discipline. Terminology that doesn't include Tartaria as an acceptable term. If you want to be taken seriously in academic history circles, you use the approved vocabulary. You talk about the Mongol successor states, or Russian expansion into Siberia, or Chinese frontier regions. But you don't say Tartaria, unless you want to be marked as someone who hasn't learned the proper academic conventions. This linguistic gatekeeping ensures that even historians who might be aware of the term don't use it in professional contexts, which further cements its exclusion from serious discourse. The word itself becomes taboo, marked as indicating either ignorance of proper terminology or affiliation with fringe theories. Either way, using it brands you as someone outside the mainstream academic conversation. Here's what really gets me. The sheer audacity of erasing something this big and expecting nobody would notice. Tartaria wasn't some minor kingdom tucked away in a corner of the world. It was allegedly a massive empire or confederation dominating half of Eurasia. And yet, within a span of about 50 years, it went from being standard geographical knowledge to being completely absent from education. That's like if in the year 2075, students were being taught world geography with no mention that India ever existed as a distinct entity. And when curious students found old maps showing India, their teachers told them, "Oh, that was just an outdated European term for the South Asian subcontinent. It didn't really mean anything." You'd recognize that as obvious historical revisionism. But because Tartaria's erasure happened far enough in the past, because it's been missing from education for several generations now, we've lost the perspective to see how absurd it is. The coordinated nature of this educational erasure is what really points to intentionality. It's not like American schools coincidentally decided to leave out Tartaria at the same time that British schools made the same decision, which coincidentally aligned with French schools making the same call, which just happened to match what Russian schools were doing, while Chinese schools independently reached the same conclusion. No, this happened in a coordinated time frame across multiple countries with different educational systems, different languages, different cultural contexts, and often hostile political relations with each other. The synchronicity is the tell. When suspicious things happen at the same time across different institutions that shouldn't be coordinating, it indicates there's a level of organization we're not being told about. And the final insult is how the education system trains people to dismiss exactly the kind of critical thinking that would lead them to question historical narratives. Students are taught to trust authority, to defer to expert consensus, to view questioning established historical narratives as the domain of crackpots and conspiracy theorists. They learn that good scholarship means accepting what the textbooks say and what established historians affirm, not investigating why certain topics are present while others are suspiciously absent. This creates a population that's been educated specifically to not notice the gaps in their education. It's the perfect crime. Convince people that looking for evidence of the crime makes you a crazy person, and the crime will never be investigated. So when you realize that entire generations have been educated to believe that Tartaria either never existed or wasn't historically significant, despite 3 centuries of cartographic evidence to the contrary, and that this educational whitewash happened suddenly, uniformly, and without explanation across multiple countries and academic systems, you start to understand the scale of what we're dealing with. This isn't just about hiding history. It's about manufacturing ignorance, about creating a population that doesn't even know what questions to ask. Because the most effective way to keep a secret isn't to prevent people from finding the answer. It's to prevent them from ever asking the question in the first place. And that's exactly what the educational system has done with Tartaria. Mission accomplished. So we've established that Tartaria got scrubbed from maps, buried under mud, and systematically removed from education across multiple countries. But here's the question that should be bothering you. How? How do you coordinate something this massive across nations that were often at war with each other? How do you ensure that cartographers in London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, and Washington all simultaneously stop acknowledging the same empire? How do you get educational institutions in competing countries to adopt the same revisionist curriculum? How do you organize the demolition of evidence at world's fairs while ensuring that city planning across continents follows the same patterns of erasure? The answer, uncomfortable as it might be, points to organizations that operate above national boundaries, that have members in positions of power across multiple governments, and that have demonstrated throughout history their ability to keep secrets and coordinate actions across vast distances. I'm talking about Freemasons and their various associated secret societies, including the Bavarian Illuminati. And before you dismiss this as standard conspiracy theory stuff, let's look at the actual documented evidence of their involvement in every single aspect of the Tartaria erasure. Let's start with something you can verify yourself: the buildings. Go look at photographs of the magnificent structures from the mid-1800s that we've been discussing, the ones that supposedly represent the height of 19th century American and European construction. Now pay attention to the architectural details, particularly the decorative elements. Notice something? Masonic symbols everywhere. Squares and compasses, the all-seeing eye, geometric patterns that represent Masonic philosophy, pillars representing Jachin and Boaz from Masonic lore. These aren't subtle little details hidden in corners. They're prominent architectural features integrated into the fundamental design of these buildings. Now, here's the uncomfortable question. If these buildings were designed and constructed by the societies that officially claim to have built them, why are they covered in Masonic symbolism? The standard explanation is that many architects and prominent citizens of the era were Masons. So naturally, they incorporated their fraternal symbolism into public buildings. Okay, but that doesn't really explain the sheer density of this symbolism or why it appears with such consistency across buildings in different cities and countries that supposedly had independent construction histories. But what if these buildings weren't built by 19th century Americans and Europeans at all? What if they're actually Tartarian structures that got inherited? And the Masonic symbols were already there because the Masons have a much older history than they publicly acknowledge. That would explain why Masonic lodges seem to have this weird reverence for ancient architecture and geometry. Not because they're honoring abstract philosophical principles, but because they're literally the inheritors of architectural knowledge from a previous civilization. The Masons have always claimed to be the keepers of ancient building secrets, the descendants of the stone masons who built Solomon's Temple and other legendary structures. What if that's not metaphorical? What if they actually possessed knowledge passed down from an earlier, more advanced civilization, specifically Tartaria? And their role in the 1800s wasn't building these magnificent structures, but rather claiming credit for them while systematically erasing evidence of who actually built them. Let's talk about the organizational structure of Freemasonry, because this is key to understanding how they could coordinate an operation of this scale. Freemasonry isn't a single monolithic organization. It's a network of lodges operating under various grand lodges, but with connections and recognition systems that allow members to identify each other and coordinate across national boundaries. A high-ranking Mason in London can connect with a high-ranking Mason in New York or St. Petersburg or Paris, regardless of whether their countries are political allies or enemies. They have their own communication channels, their own codes, their own methods of confirming identity and rank. During the 1800s, the exact period when Tartaria was being erased, Freemasonry was experiencing explosive growth in membership and influence. Political leaders, business magnates, military officers, academics, and cultural leaders were joining lodges in unprecedented numbers. This gave the organization infiltration into virtually every institution that would be needed to coordinate a historical cover-up. Government archives, educational systems, publishing houses, cartographic institutions, architectural firms, and city planning departments. And here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at who was organizing the World's Fairs that we discussed earlier, those massive exhibitions where Tartarian buildings were supposedly temporarily constructed and then demolished, you find Masons everywhere. The organizing committees, the chief architects, the financial backers, the government officials who approved these projects. A disproportionate number of them were high-ranking Freemasons. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, for instance, which created the White City and then demolished it. Daniel Burnham, the chief architect, was a Freemason. Many of the other planners and backers were connected to Masonic lodges. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. These are documented historical facts. Their membership in Masonic lodges is a matter of public record. The question is, why does this pattern repeat across multiple World's Fairs in different countries? Why do we consistently find Masonic involvement in events that seem designed to catalog and then destroy evidence of advanced architecture that officially shouldn't exist? Now let's bring in the Bavarian Illuminati, because their timing is too suspicious to ignore. The Illuminati were founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, and their stated goal was to promote Enlightenment ideals and reduce religious and monarchical influence over public life. That's the official story. But what's interesting is their method: infiltrating other organizations, particularly Masonic lodges, and using those networks to spread their influence. By the early 1800s, the Illuminati had supposedly been suppressed by the Bavarian government and disbanded. Except there's significant evidence that they just went underground, continued operating through Masonic networks, and maintained their goal of reshaping society according to their vision. And here's the thing about timing: the period when the Illuminati were at their most active in infiltrating Masonic lodges, late 1700s through mid-1800s, coincides exactly with when Tartaria starts disappearing from maps and when the modern educational and governmental systems were being established. Coincidence? Maybe, but probably not. The symbol that best represents this connection is the all-seeing eye atop a pyramid, which became prominently associated with the Illuminati and appears on the Great Seal of the United States, adopted in 1782. Now here's what's weird. This symbol starts appearing with increasing frequency on buildings, currency, and official seals throughout the 1800s. The exact period of the Tartaria erasure. It's on government buildings, courthouses, banks, and educational institutions across multiple countries. And it's not just a random decorative element. It's prominently displayed, often in the most important architectural positions. The standard explanation is that it represents divine providence watching over humanity, or the importance of knowledge and enlightenment. But symbols can have multiple meanings, and for organizations involved in a massive historical cover-up, displaying this symbol everywhere might be a way of marking territory. We were here. We organized this. We control this narrative. It's like a signature hidden in plain sight because most people don't know what they're looking at. Let's talk about archives and libraries, because controlling physical documents is crucial for controlling historical narratives. During the 1800s, major libraries and archival institutions were being established or reorganized in cities around the world. The people running these institutions, the library directors, the chief archivists, the board members overseeing their operations, were often Freemasons. This gave them control over what documents were preserved, how they were cataloged, what researchers had access to, and crucially, what materials might be lost or damaged, or relegated to restricted collections where nobody would think to look for them. If you wanted to erase documentary evidence of Tartaria, controlling the institutions that house historical documents would be essential. And that's exactly what we see: a disproportionate Masonic presence in positions of archival and library authority during the critical period when Tartaria would have been disappearing from accessible historical records. The same pattern appears in educational institutions. When you trace the founding of major universities in the 1800s, or the reorganization of existing universities into their modern forms, you consistently find Masonic involvement. Founding presidents were Masons, major donors were Masons, board trustees were Masons. This isn't surprising given that Freemasonry attracted wealthy, educated, and influential men. So of course they'd be involved in establishing educational institutions. But it does mean that the organizations had influence over what would be taught in these universities, what research would be funded, what theories would be considered academically respectable, and what topics would be dismissed as fringe or unworthy of serious investigation. If you control universities, you control the training of future teachers, professors, and researchers, which means you control the long-term perpetuation of whatever historical narrative you want to establish. Any evidence of Tartaria that contradicted the approved narrative could be systematically excluded from curricula, and any scholar who tried to investigate it could find their career prospects mysteriously blocked by colleagues and administrators who shared certain fraternal connections. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not every Freemason was involved in or even aware of this larger operation. Freemasonry has degrees, and information is compartmentalized. Lower degree Masons genuinely believe the organization is just a fraternal brotherhood focused on self-improvement, charity, and moral development. They participate in rituals they might not fully understand, they network with other members, and they contribute to community service projects. They're not sitting in lodge meetings plotting historical erasure. But higher degree Masons, those in the inner circles, those who reach the 32nd and 33rd degrees of Scottish Rite or equivalent high positions in other Masonic systems, they have access to information and participate in decisions that lower members never hear about. That's how secret societies work. Layers of membership, with each layer knowing only what they need to know for their level. So the vast majority of Masons throughout history could have been completely innocent, well-meaning people, while a small elite at the top coordinated operations that would seem impossible if you only looked at the organization's public face. This compartmentalization also provides plausible deniability. If anyone accuses Freemasonry of coordinating a historical cover-up, the response from lower degree members will be genuine confusion and denial. What? No, we just do charity work and have dinner meetings. That sounds ridiculous. And they're not lying. From their perspective, that really is what the organization does. But that doesn't mean the people at the top, who control the information flow and make the real decisions, aren't engaged in very different activities. It's a brilliant system for maintaining secrecy. The majority of your membership can honestly deny what the organization is actually doing because they genuinely don't know. Let's look at city planning in the 1800s, because this is where Masonic involvement becomes impossible to ignore. Major cities across America were redesigned according to geometric patterns that reflect Masonic symbolism. Washington, D.C. is the most famous example. The street layout contains pentagrams, squares, compasses, and other geometric figures that only become visible when you look at the city from above or study detailed maps. Pierre L'Enfant, who designed the city's layout, was a Freemason. But it's not just Washington. Philadelphia, whose city hall is covered in Masonic symbolism, designed with Masonic involvement. Chicago's city planning after the fire of 1871, overseen by Daniel Burnham and other Masonic architects. St. Petersburg, Russia, built with extensive Masonic involvement in its architectural planning. Paris's reconstruction under Baron Haussmann in the 1850s and 1860s. Haussmann was connected to Masonic networks. Over and over, you find the same pattern. Major urban redesigns during the period when Tartaria was being erased, coordinated by people with Masonic affiliations, following geometric principles that reflect Masonic symbolism. But why would city planning matter for a historical cover-up? Because city layout determines what buildings get preserved and what gets demolished, where new construction happens and where old structures are allowed to decay, which neighborhoods get modernized and which get buried under new development. If you control city planning, you control the physical landscape of memory. You can ensure that Tartarian structures either get demolished or get buried or get modified so extensively that their original character is no longer recognizable. You can also ensure that new construction follows patterns and principles that help people forget what was there before. The shift from ornate, geometrically sophisticated 19th century architecture to the stark, minimalist modernism of the 20th century wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a deliberate break from architectural traditions that connected too obviously to pre-erasure civilizations, and who promoted modernist architecture and the demolition of outdated 19th century structures, often the same institutional networks influenced by Masonic and associated organizations. Here's something else that's documented but rarely discussed in this context. Masonic lodges maintain extensive private libraries and archives containing historical documents, rare books, and manuscripts that aren't accessible to the general public. If you're not a Mason, or at least not a high-ranking Mason, you can't access these materials. We know these collections exist because Masons have occasionally published catalogs or mentioned their holdings in Masonic journals. But we don't really know what's in them comprehensively because they're not open to independent researchers. Now think about this. If your organization was involved in erasing a civilization from history, wouldn't you want to keep some records of what actually happened? If only so, the people at the top would know the real story and could ensure the cover-up remained consistent over time. Private Masonic archives would be the perfect place to store such documents. Protected from public view, accessible only to those who've proven their trustworthiness through initiation and advancement in the organization, and maintained across generations through institutional continuity that survives longer than any individual member's lifetime. The connection between Masonic ritual and knowledge of ancient civilizations is also worth examining. Masonic degrees involve ceremonial presentations of legendary histories about the building of Solomon's Temple, the preservation of ancient mysteries, and the transmission of sacred knowledge through secret lineages. Members are told these are symbolic teachings meant to convey moral lessons. But what if there's actual historical knowledge embedded in these rituals? What if the stories about preserving ancient wisdom aren't purely metaphorical, but refer to actual information about pre-existing civilizations that the organization has protected? If Freemasonry inherited knowledge from Tartaria, either because some Tartarian scholars and architects joined Masonic organizations as their own civilization fell, or because Masonic networks deliberately extracted information from Tartarian sources before erasing them, then the rituals might serve a dual purpose, teaching initiates about moral principles while also encoding actual historical information in forms that seem symbolic to outsiders but mean something more specific to those who understand the real context. Let's address the funding question, because operations of this scale require enormous resources. How do you finance the demolition of buildings at World's Fairs? How do you pay for the coordination of map revisions across multiple countries? How do you fund the reorganization of educational systems and the establishment of new archives and libraries? You need wealthy backers, and not just ordinary wealthy. You need people wealthy enough to fund projects without expecting obvious financial returns. People who are motivated by ideology or long-term strategic goals rather than immediate profit. And when you look at the major industrialists and financiers of the 1800s, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, and others who controlled vast fortunes, many were either Freemasons themselves or closely connected to Masonic networks. They had the resources to fund large-scale projects whose purposes wouldn't be obvious to outsiders. And they had the organizational connections to ensure those projects served coordinated goals rather than random individual interests. There's also the matter of international coordination during a period when nations were often hostile to each other. The 1800s saw numerous wars: the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, various colonial conflicts, and rising tensions that would eventually lead to World War I. Yet somehow, during all this political chaos and military conflict, we're supposed to believe that various initiatives, removing Tartaria from maps, revising educational curricula, reorganizing archives, planning World's Fairs, all happened in synchronized ways across enemy nations just by coincidence. Or is it more plausible that there was an organizational network that transcended national politics, that maintained communication and coordination even when the countries its members lived in were at war with each other? Freemasonry explicitly presents itself as a brotherhood that crosses national boundaries, where a Mason is supposed to recognize and assist another Mason regardless of nationality. During periods of conflict, this international network would have continued functioning, allowing coordination of activities that national governments couldn't or wouldn't undertake openly. The symbols themselves are a form of communication for those who know how to read them. When you see a building with prominent Masonic symbols, you're seeing a message. This structure is under our protection, or this structure serves our purposes, or this location is significant to our operations. To the uninitiated public, these are just decorative elements or civic symbols of enlightenment and progress. But to members of the organization, they might signify something more specific. This is how secret societies have always operated, hiding their real communications in plain sight, using symbols and references that seem innocent to outsiders, but carry specific meanings for initiates. If you wanted to mark which buildings were actually Tartarian structures that had been claimed and repurposed, putting Masonic symbols on them would be a way to do it. Future generations of members would know buildings with these markers have special historical significance beyond their official construction dates. The Illuminati connection deserves deeper investigation because their influence on Masonic lodges in the late 1700s and early 1800s is documented even by mainstream historians. Though usually dismissed as a historical curiosity that didn't have lasting effects. But if you trace the timing of Illuminati infiltration of Masonic lodges and the subsequent reorganization of those lodges' priorities and activities, it lines up suspiciously well with the beginning of the Tartaria erasure. The Illuminati allegedly brought a more radical political agenda to Freemasonry. Ideas about remaking society, controlling education and religion, and establishing new forms of governance. If they were also working on a project to erase inconvenient historical evidence and establish a new narrative that would serve their long-term goals, Masonic networks would be the perfect vehicle for implementing it. By the time the Illuminati were supposedly disbanded in the 1780s, their ideas and organizational methods had already spread through European Masonic lodges. Even if the specific organization called the Illuminati ceased to exist publicly, the network they'd created and the agenda they'd established could continue operating under the cover of established Masonic structures. Let's also consider the psychological dimension of secret society membership. When you're initiated into a brotherhood that claims to possess ancient wisdom, when you advance through degrees that promise deeper understanding at each level, when you're told that you're part of an elite group working for the betterment of humanity through means that outsiders wouldn't understand, you become invested in the organization's goals and protective of its secrets. Even if you gradually discover that the organization has been involved in morally questionable activities, like erasing a civilization from history, you're unlikely to expose it because you've invested years of your life in advancing through its ranks. You've formed deep bonds with other members, and you've been conditioned to believe that what seems wrong from an outside perspective actually serves a greater good that you understand because of your elevated position. This psychological capture is how secret societies maintain loyalty and silence, even when their activities might trouble individual members. By the time you know enough to be dangerous, you're too invested to leave. The pattern of Masonic involvement isn't limited to one or two aspects of the Tartaria erasure. It appears in every single dimension we've discussed. Maps getting changed? Cartographic institutions led by Masons. Buildings getting demolished or buried? City planning controlled by Masons. Education getting revised? Universities founded and run by Masons. Archives being reorganized? Libraries directed by Masons. World's fairs showcasing and then destroying evidence? Organized by Masons. This isn't a few coincidences. It's a systematic pattern that points to coordinated action. And the organization had the structure, the international reach, the compartmentalized hierarchy, the financial backing, and the ideological motivation to pull off an operation of this scale. So when you're looking at the erasure of Tartaria and asking yourself how something so massive could have been coordinated across hostile nations, across different institutions, across multiple levels of society, all while maintaining secrecy that has lasted for over a century, the answer becomes clear when you look at who was actually in positions of power during the critical period. Secret societies with international networks, compartmentalized knowledge, coordinated communication systems, and members placed in every institution that would be needed to control historical narratives. Not every Mason was complicit. Not every member knew what was happening. But the organizational structure existed, the people in key positions had the right affiliations, and the pattern of their involvement is too consistent to be coincidental. The architects of the erasure weren't working alone or independently. They were connected through fraternal bonds that transcended national boundaries and united them in common cause. Whether you want to call it Freemasonry, Illuminati, or just secret societies generally, the mechanism for coordination was right there, hiding in plain sight beneath square and compass symbols that most people walk past every day without understanding their significance. The conspiracy isn't theory, it's architecture, it's urban planning, it's documented membership rosters. And once you see the symbols, you can't unsee them. They're everywhere, marking the territory of organizations that helped reshape history according to their vision of how the story should be told. So we've talked about how Tartaria got erased from maps, manuscripts, education, and physical reality back in the 1800s, all coordinated by secret societies with the resources and motivation to pull off something this massive. Now here's the uncomfortable update. It's still happening. The erasure didn't stop once the last textbook was rewritten or the last building was demolished. It's an ongoing operation, and thanks to modern technology, we can actually watch it happen in real time if you know where to look. Satellite imagery, digital mapping services, online information platforms. They've all become new battlegrounds in the war against historical memory. And just like in the 1800s, there are people in positions of authority actively working to ensure that evidence of Tartaria stays buried, deleted, or censored. Except now, instead of literally burying buildings under mud, they're digitally erasing images from Google Earth. Progress, right? Let's start with something anyone can verify, or at least could verify before it got scrubbed. Google Earth and Google Maps, those supposedly neutral tools for exploring our planet from the comfort of your couch, have some very interesting gaps in their coverage. I'm not talking about the expected blurring of military bases or government facilities where national security is a legitimate concern. I'm talking about random patches of Siberia and Central Asia where the satellite imagery suddenly goes pixelated, or switches to obviously outdated low-resolution images, or just shows cloud cover that never seems to clear no matter when you check. These aren't population centers or strategic installations. They're remote areas in regions that historically would have been part of Tartaria. And when researchers have tried to investigate what's actually in these censored zones, they find that the imagery keeps changing. Something that showed an interesting geometric structure one month will be blurred out the next month, or replaced with imagery from a different time period that conveniently doesn't show the same features. It's digital archaeology in reverse. Instead of uncovering the past, someone's actively covering it up. Now, Google's official explanation when pressed about these gaps is usually something bland about data quality issues, or licensing restrictions, or outdated imagery awaiting updates, which would be believable if the pattern was random. But it's not random. When independent researchers started documenting and mapping these censored zones, patterns emerged. The blanked-out areas cluster in regions that correspond to historical Tartarian territories. They're often centered on geographical features that satellite imagery suggests might be artificial structures. Geometric patterns visible from above, unusual formations that look manufactured rather than natural, and straight lines cutting across terrain in ways that nature doesn't typically create. And here's the kicker. Some of these anomalies were visible on earlier versions of Google Earth. Screenshots were taken, discussions were had in forums, and then in subsequent updates. Poof! Censored, blurred, or replaced with different imagery. That's not a glitch or a licensing issue. That's deliberate content management. Let's talk about Antarctica, because this is where things get properly weird. Antarctica is supposedly a frozen wasteland, right? Nothing there but ice, penguins, and a few research stations studying climate and geology. Except satellite imagery keeps showing things that shouldn't be there. Pyramid-shaped formations that look too geometric to be natural mountains. Structures that appear to have straight edges and right angles poking through the ice. Patterns that suggest underground complexes or ancient construction buried beneath millennia of ice accumulation. And before you say, those are just natural geological formations being misinterpreted, consider this. Multiple researchers have identified these anomalies, posted analysis showing why they appear artificial, and then watched as Google Earth updates, specifically blur out or lower the resolution of exactly those areas. If they're just mountains and natural features, why the selective censorship? Why not leave the high-resolution imagery up and let geologists explain it as natural? The fact that someone is actively managing what we're allowed to see suggests there's something there they don't want us examining too closely. There's also the matter of the International Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1959 and basically designates the entire continent as off-limits for anything except scientific research, with military activities explicitly prohibited. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. Let's preserve this pristine environment for science and prevent it from becoming a geopolitical battleground. But the treaty also means that independent researchers can't just charter a boat to Antarctica and go exploring whatever catches their interest. You need permits, official approval, and you're limited to designated areas under the supervision of government-sanctioned programs. Convenient, right? If there are remnants of Tartarian civilization under the Antarctic ice, maybe the last refuge of their elite before the final collapse, as some researchers have theorized. Then, an international treaty that makes independent investigation, essentially, impossible would be a perfect way to control access to that evidence. And the timing is suspicious too. 1959, right in the middle of the Cold War when the US and Soviet Union couldn't agree on anything. Yet somehow they and multiple other nations all signed on to making Antarctica a restricted zone. What could get Cold War enemies to cooperate so readily? Maybe the discovery of something that threatened the official historical narrative both sides had been maintaining since the mid-1800s. Speaking of Antarctica, let's talk about Operation High Jump, because this deserves more attention than it gets in mainstream discussions. In 1946 to 1947, the United States Navy launched a massive expedition to Antarctica, led by Admiral Richard Byrd. This wasn't a small scientific mission. They brought 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. For perspective, that's a larger military force than many countries deployed in actual wars during that era. The official explanation was that they were establishing a base, testing equipment in cold weather conditions, and mapping the continent. Okay. But you don't need nearly 5,000 people and a full naval task force to test some cold weather gear and make maps, especially when the expedition was only supposed to last 8 months. Even stranger, they came back early. Despite planning for an 8-month mission and deploying massive resources, Operation High Jump packed up and left after only about 2 months. The official reports say they accomplished their objectives ahead of schedule, But Admiral Byrd's interviews afterward tell a different story. He talked about the strategic importance of Antarctica, made cryptic references to what they'd encountered, and allegedly kept personal journals describing discoveries that were never included in the official reports. Now, Byrd's complete journals are disputed. There are claims they describe encounters with an advanced civilization living underground in Antarctica. But historians argue those diary entries are fabrications added later by conspiracy theorists. Maybe so. But even if the dramatic stuff is made up, the basic facts remain. The U.S. sent a massive military expedition to Antarctica in 1946. They left early under circumstances that weren't fully explained. And in the years following, Antarctica became subject to international treaties that severely restricted access. That's all documented. You can argue about the interpretation, but the events themselves are historical record. And if you were running a global operation to suppress evidence of a previous advanced civilization, and you suspected that remnants or records might exist under Antarctic ice, what would you do? You'd send a military expedition to investigate. And if they found something that confirmed your worst fears about what people might discover, you'd immediately work to establish international controls preventing anyone else from looking. Which is exactly the sequence of events we observe. Then there are the electromagnetic anomalies that researchers keep documenting over regions that historically would have been Tartarian territories. These aren't the normal variations in Earth's magnetic field that geologists expect. They're unusually strong, localized anomalies that don't have obvious geological explanations. Some of these anomalies correlate with the locations of star forts, those geometric fortifications scattered across Europe, Asia, and America, that official history claims were military installations, but that alternative researchers suggest might have been energy generation or transmission facilities for Tartarian technology. When you map electromagnetic anomalies and overlay them with maps showing where Tartaria existed and where star forts are located, the correlation is unsettling. It's like there's still some kind of energy signature or technological residue in these locations, something that can be detected with modern instruments, but that has no explanation in conventional historical or geological frameworks. But here's what's interesting about the electromagnetic data. It's not being openly studied. Papers that attempt to investigate these anomalies in the context of possible ancient technology get rejected from mainstream journals. Researchers who pursue this line of inquiry find their funding cut off. Graduate students who express interest in these questions get steered toward more conventional topics by advisors who want to protect their academic careers. And when data does get published showing unusual electromagnetic signatures in these regions, the papers focus only on geological explanations. Unexplained magnetic anomalies, possibly due to mineral deposits or volcanic activity, without ever considering that artificial structures might be responsible. The research that's allowed to proceed is carefully bounded to avoid conclusions that would threaten the official narrative. Let's talk about whistleblowers, because there have been some interesting testimonies from people with inside knowledge. Military personnel who worked in Antarctica and were stationed in restricted zones have come forward, usually after retiring and usually anonymously, describing structures they encountered that couldn't be explained by natural geology. Areas where drilling or excavation revealed manufactured materials or construction that predated human presence according to official timelines, orders to document findings, but then classification of those documents so they never enter public record. Academic researchers have also spoken out, describing how papers on controversial topics related to Central Asian history or advanced ancient civilizations get blocked at peer review. How archaeological digs in certain regions of Siberia are suddenly shut down when they start finding anomalous artifacts. How museum collections include objects that don't fit the official timeline but are kept in storage rather than displayed because nobody wants to deal with the implications. These testimonies are frustratingly difficult to verify, because whistleblowers usually won't provide identifying information. They're scared of professional and personal consequences. And that fear is probably justified. Because when people do go on record with claims that threaten official narratives, they tend to get discredited rapidly. Their credentials get questioned, their mental stability gets suggested as dubious, and if they were government employees, their security clearances get cited as reasons why they can't provide evidence for their claims. It's a perfect catch-22. You can't prove what you're saying because the evidence is classified. But your inability to provide evidence is used to dismiss your claims as baseless. Meanwhile, the general public learns that asking questions about these topics brands you as a conspiracy theorist. So, even if people are curious, social pressure keeps them from investigating too deeply. Google Maps and other mapping services show another interesting pattern. The updates aren't consistent across all regions. Areas that are politically or commercially important get regular, high-resolution updates. You can see new construction in major cities almost as soon as it's completed. But large swaths of Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of Mongolia, regions that overlap with historical Tartarian territories, have imagery that's years out of date. And when updates do happen, they often replace higher-resolution images with lower-resolution versions rather than improving quality. Why would commercial mapping services, which profit from having the most current and detailed imagery possible, deliberately maintain worse coverage in specific regions? The official explanation is that these areas are remote and sparsely populated, so there's less commercial incentive to update them. But the same services provide detailed updates for equally remote areas in Canada, Australia, and Alaska. The selective neglect points to something other than just commercial priorities. There's also the phenomenon of imagery being modified in updates. Researchers who study satellite images for archaeological purposes have documented cases where interesting features visible in one version of Google Earth or Maps are altered or removed in subsequent versions. A geometric pattern visible in a field in Siberia in the 2015 imagery might be absent in the 2020 imagery of the same location. A structure poking through snow in Antarctica might be blurred to unrecognizability in the next update. And these aren't improvements in image quality revealing that what looked like a structure was actually just a shadow or natural feature. These are deliberate reductions in detail or replacement with images from different time periods. Someone is curating what we're allowed to see, and that curation is removing things that might prompt uncomfortable questions about what's actually on the ground in these regions. The contrail phenomenon is another modern mystery that might connect to all this. People have documented unusual flight patterns over former Tartarian territories, contrails that don't match commercial or known military flight routes, patterns that seem designed to create specific geometric shapes visible from above, and repeated, patterns that suggest systematic operations rather than random flights. Now, the mainstream explanation for unusual contrails is usually weather modification or geoengineering programs, which are controversial enough topics by themselves. But some researchers have noted that the contrail patterns are particularly dense over regions where electromagnetic anomalies have been detected, and over areas where satellite imagery has been censored. If there were ongoing operations to suppress or monitor something in these regions, maybe checking for energy signatures, maybe using aircraft-mounted sensors to detect underground structures, maybe deploying technology to suppress electromagnetic anomalies that might draw attention, you'd expect to see unusual flight patterns that don't match commercial aviation. And that's what we observe. The information suppression extends to online platforms beyond just mapping services. Try posting detailed analysis about Tartaria on mainstream social media platforms or video sharing sites. If your content gains traction, you'll likely find it being algorithmically suppressed. Not removed entirely, which would be too obvious, but shadow banned so it doesn't appear in recommendations or search results as prominently as view counts would suggest it should. Channels focused on alternative history, particularly regarding Tartaria, often report that their growth suddenly plateaus despite consistent content quality, or that videos on certain topics get age-restricted or demonetized for violating community guidelines even when the content is purely educational. Meanwhile, debunking videos or content dismissing Tartaria as conspiracy theory get algorithmic promotion. It's subtle enough that the platforms can claim they're not censoring anyone, just enforcing their standards consistently. But the pattern of what gets suppressed versus what gets promoted reveals a bias. Wikipedia, which many people treat as a neutral source of information, is another interesting case study. The Tartaria entries on Wikipedia are carefully managed to present it as nothing more than a geographical term for an ill-defined region, with any suggestion that it represented an actual unified political entity dismissed as conspiracy theory. The discussion pages behind these articles reveal constant battles between editors trying to add substantive information about historical evidence for Tartaria, and moderators removing that information as unreliable or non-notable. The editors who control these articles, and yes, there are specific Wikipedia editors who monitor and control what stays in articles about controversial historical topics, cite mainstream historical sources as the standard for inclusion. But of course, mainstream sources don't acknowledge Tartaria as significant because of the erasure we've been discussing. It's circular reasoning enforced through digital gatekeeping, and it's remarkably effective at ensuring that the first place most people check for information about Tartaria tells them there's nothing to investigate. Academic suppression continues in the digital age too. Research databases and journal archives have made searching for information easier in many ways, but they've also made it easier to control what information is accessible. Papers that question standard historical narratives about Central Asian history often don't make it into major databases, or they get classified in ways that make them hard to find unless you already know they exist. University institutional repositories, which are supposed to preserve all scholarly work produced by their faculty and students, mysteriously seem to be missing theses or papers on controversial topics. You'll find references to them in bibliographies or see them cited in other works, but the actual documents aren't available digitally. And when you try to find physical copies, they're not on the shelves or have been temporarily relocated for preservation or some other excuse. The ability to make information digitally available has been accompanied by the power to make information digitally unavailable, and that power is being used selectively. There's also the matter of domain name seizures and website shutdowns. Several websites that hosted extensive archives of historical maps, documents, and analysis about Tartaria have mysteriously gone offline over the past decade. Sometimes the owners claim technical difficulties or financial inability to maintain the sites. Other times the sites just disappear without explanation, the domain names eventually expiring or being taken over by unrelated parties. Wayback Machine archives of these sites exist, but they're incomplete. Certain sections weren't archived, or the images don't load, or the documents that were available for download are no longer accessible. When so much information is digital, making it disappear becomes easier in some ways than when everything was physical. At least with a physical book, you'd have to track down every copy and destroy them. With a website, you just need to take down the server and make sure no comprehensive backups exist in public archives. The modern surveillance state also makes it easier to monitor who's researching what. If you're searching extensively for information about Tartaria, downloading old maps, joining forums discussing alternative history, or posting analysis that challenges official narratives, that digital footprint exists. Intelligence agencies and data analysis companies can track these patterns. They might not care about most people doing casual research, But if someone is getting close to something particularly sensitive, maybe they're a credentialed academic whose work might get attention, or they have resources to fund serious archaeological investigation, or they're connecting dots in ways that could prompt wider questioning of historical narratives, it would be easy to identify them. And once identified, various mechanisms exist to discourage their continued investigation without resorting to anything as crude as direct threats. Professional opportunities might mysteriously dry up. Funding might get harder to secure. Articles might get rejected with vague explanations. It's soft suppression, but it's effective. What's particularly frustrating about all this modern suppression is how it operates under a veneer of openness and transparency. We're told we live in an information age where anyone can research anything, where the internet has democratized knowledge, where Google Earth lets anyone be an explorer from their couch. And that's true to a degree. We have access to more information than ever before. But we also have more sophisticated information control than ever before. The gatekeepers aren't burning books in public squares where everyone can see censorship happening. They're adjusting algorithms, selectively updating satellite imagery, shadow banning content, managing Wikipedia entries, and ensuring that mainstream sources don't validate research questions that might lead to uncomfortable truths. It's censorship optimized for the digital age, nearly invisible unless you're specifically looking for patterns of what's being suppressed. The existence of this ongoing suppression actually strengthens the case that there's something real about Tartaria worth hiding. If it was just a historical misconception or a fringe conspiracy theory with no basis in fact, why bother managing satellite imagery? Why coordinate suppression across multiple platforms? Why work so hard to ensure that certain research questions don't get asked or pursued? The effort being put into maintaining the erasure in the digital age suggests that whoever orchestrated the original cover-up understands that modern technology could potentially expose what they worked so hard to bury in the 1800s. Every blurred satellite image, every algorithmically suppressed video, every mysteriously offline archive is evidence that someone with resources and authority still considers Tartaria a secret worth protecting. So when you're browsing Google Earth or searching for historical information online, remember that what you're seeing has been curated. The satellite images have been reviewed and in some cases modified. The search results have been ranked by algorithms that aren't neutral. The Wikipedia entries have been edited by gatekeepers with specific agendas. The academic papers have been filtered through peer review processes that enforce orthodox interpretations. And somewhere, people in positions we'll never know about are monitoring these information flows, making decisions about what the public should and shouldn't be able to access easily, and ensuring that the great erasure that started in the 1800s continues effectively in the 21st century. The tools have changed, but the project remains the same. Keep Tartaria forgotten.